Right, chapters 9 through 10 in part 2. So this is probably my favorite part of the chapter, because this is as like climactic as you're gonna get, because 1984 is an sort of anticlimactic ending, but it's also an important ending. So we start off with Hate Week, right? Hate Week is in full swing. Winston is exhausted because they've had to change the enemy. We talked about this in propaganda earlier in the discussions. Propaganda is a tool to control the masses. And the less time you can spend in your life as a human being not being swayed by propaganda. And we're probably in a time where it's an epidemic with regards to social media and its reach, and people not having the critical thinking skills to tell the difference between propaganda and real news, and constantly throwing out that fake news kind of thing towards anything that they disagree with. Governments are having probably their heyday. They're at their prime, their peak of propaganda spreading. And that's what Hate Week is all about. Give them an outlet and then, you know, embarrass them. Even though we're changing it, you're like mad at the wrong person and you feel embarrassed and you're like, maybe I was wrong. So you really have a strong control over what your population thinks and how they react. And we talked about enemies that many governments pick for their people to hate, and then they spread falsehoods, and a lot of violence is targeted towards that group of people. And it happens in modern day. And if you feel like a government is putting out news that makes you hate people, you really should question that response. Because if you're getting an emotional response from news that isn't like tragic, I'm not saying news of everyday things where children die or whatever. I'm saying if when they put out a normal news story reporting what's happening in the world and it gives you an emotional response, then you have to think twice about the way that that newscaster is putting that piece of information to you. Okay, so we get into this, and the war is peace, ignorance is strength plays in the party slogans. War is peace. You can only, you know, it's that double speak happening. War is peace. When we are at war, we are at peace. Our people are good and happy. And ignorance is our strength. Don't bother thinking for yourself. We'll do the thinking for you as your government. Okay? So this is a breakdown of how the people are separated in Big Brother's sort of world. And it's really interesting. The high class represents the inner party. Like, even if you think about it in modern day terms. So I'm going to do it for you. It's a three-way sort of equalization. Okay, so the high class represents the inner party. And the inner party represents modern day elites. Okay, we hear that word a lot. So modern day people, people in our society who have a lot of money and can make things happen, or who have interests in governments, those people. Then we have the middle class of people in their society. The middle class is represented by the outer party, which is pretty much equivalent to our current day middle class. And everyone is in the lower class is chasing to be a part of the middle class. That's the difference in our society versus their society. Everybody wants to have a piece of their own sort of little happy life. And then we have the low class, and I talked about this in the last one, who are equal to the paroles, who are equal to marginalized people in our everyday life right now in 2019. Or whenever you're watching this. I don't know. If my kids watch this in the future, then. I hope things are different though. And it's very interesting if you look at the breakdown of how these three sort of communities or governments developed. Eurasia was basically Russia taking the majority of Europe. And Oceania was the US taking the British Empire. So they don't specify if that includes Australia. And then East Asia were the remaining nations who joined together like an allied force. So it's really interesting because that would mean that East Asia was mostly, I guess, everything lower, and like Africa and like New Zealand I don't know. It's very interesting to me. I found that interesting, and I always kind of sat with that, trying to figure out how that was done. And I'm like looking at a global map here, and that's basically, I mean, I guess, no, a lot of Africa would be considered a part of the British Empire. So yeah, I don't know. That's just an interesting thought. Side note, I went off on a tangent. But it is important to make that modern day connection when you think about allied forces and countries who sort of band together today in modern day history, and how this can all be applied. And we're seeing that Russia is taking over parts, or trying to, what was the Georgia, when they attacked Georgia, and previously they've done this, and with the USSR. So this has happened previously, and you got to remember that Orwell is writing this a long time ago, not knowing about what's happening in the 2000s. He has no idea, unless he was like Nostradamus. But the one thing that he knew is that history is a cycle, and that these things are bound to happen again, because absolute power corrupts absolutely. And if you get a little bit of power, you're going to try and take more. So he plays off of that very well. And then this other important part that you want to get from these chapters is war itself is a weapon of elite men. And that is the truth. I'm not here to argue this with anyone. People who send their armies and their nation's children into war do so without usually facing the consequences of those wars personally. So you, as a marginalized person, or as a middle-class person, or as a low-class person, however you want to classify yourself, not a part of the elites over there, you are someone who your government is willing to risk sending you to war because they cannot work out their differences in an adult fashion, right? So that's happened with all the world wars, the Korean wars, the India-Pakistan wars, wars all over the world are usually fought by men in the elite group, feeding their people ideas and the thought that their way of life is in jeopardy if they don't fight this war on behalf of me, your elite government. Okay, so that's what you need to remember. And that is how you make the modern day connection, because war itself, the threat of war is a tool for modern day elite men, and even way back when, so maybe not even modern day, to control their people and their emotions, and to have a place for it. Okay, and then the paperweight, so chapter 10, that all happens in chapter 9, okay? And then my dog is barking, so he's throwing me off. The inner party are equal to rich modern day society, and we've talked about that. So chapter 10 is when they get booked. Winston and Julia get booked, and that Mr. Charrington speaks through that picture of St. Clement's Church. He says, "Here comes a candle to light you to bed. Here comes the chopper to chop off your head." And I told you that would be foreshadowing to their end. So that's what's happened. They've been booked. And another symbolic thing here is that beautiful paperweight with that little piece of coral shatters. And you're left with that. Now we go into book 3.